welcome to my talk and thank you for joining me. The topic of my talk is there successively collective authorship of abstract artifacts? This question arises from a putative contradiction which consists of three assumptions. And with this contradiction, I would like to start my talk. So the first assumption is there is successively collective authorship. And think of a novel which was started by one author and then finished by another author, maybe because the first author died in the process of writing, that we have, as it seems, successively collective authorship. The second assumption, excuse me, the second assumption is that collective authorship requires interaction. As a mode of collective acting, collective authoring requires the agents to coordinate their intentions and coordinate their actions in authoring the artifact. However, and that's the third assumption, successive interaction is impossible because interaction is necessarily simultaneously. But I will argue that this is not the case. There is successive interaction, and therefore my claim is successively collective authorship is possible. My talk consists of three parts. The first part is dedicated to the question, what is collective authorship? And after answering that question, I will give you an answer to the question if there is successively collective authorship. And third part is dedicated to the question, what is not successively collective authorship, but what one might think is successively collective authorship. So let me start by give you a definition of collective authorship. I think collective authorship is best understood as a causal relation between some agents and an artifact which these agents have created, have brought into existence, and they've brought the artifact into existence by determining the essential properties of the artifact. These essential properties are sometimes called a sortal description in the philosophy of artifacts, but it's quite the same as a sortal description. So what is essential for this artifact to be this artifact is what the agents, the authors of this artifact determine. However, I think that in each and every case, agents create an artifact. They first and foremost not create an artifact which is concrete, but an abstract artifact. And therefore, we have to be more precise. So, and I will call this causal relation between an agent and an artifact type and the tokens of this artifact type collective authorship. But I will differentiate between the relation between agents and the artifact type they created as primary authorship, and between primary authorship and secondary authorship, which is the causal relationship between agents and the artifact tokens, the tokens of the artifact type they have created. That leads us to the following definition of authorship. An agent X is author of an artifact type Z and its tokens if X brought Z into existence by determining its essential properties. What's collective about collective authorship is, as it appears to me, that we have not a single agent, and that these agents have, as I already pointed out to you, have to interact. And that leads us to the definition of collective authorship, which goes as follows. Two or more agents, X and Y, are collective authors of an artifact type Z and its tokens if X and Y brought Z into existence by interacting in determining Z's essential properties. That's what I call collective authorship. However, this definition raises the question what I mean by interacting or interaction. Let me give you a short definition. I think all that's necessary is a kind of weak interaction. And by weak interaction, I mean the following: two agents, X and Y, interact in a weak sense if first X acts and second X intends Y to act in coherence with X's intentions, and third, Y acts in coherence with X's intentions, or vice versa. That's all it's need for interaction. And if these conditions are met, then we have a sort of a weak interaction that gives us the possibility for agents to collectively author an artifact. Let me come to the second question. Now, is there successively collective authorship? What do I mean by successively collective authorship? Well, here's my definition. Two agents, X and Y, are successively collective authors of an artifact type Z and its tokens if X and Y brought Z into existence by interacting in determining Z's essential properties over time. So here we have this little twist, what differentiates collective authorship or simultaneous collective authorship from successively collective authorship. Now, how should we think of how two agents interact in determining Z's essential properties over time? Well, my claim is that there is successively collective authorship if first an agent X determines some of the essential properties of the artifact type Z herself at a given time T1, and second, at T1 she also designates Z's remaining essential properties to be determined by an agent Y, and third, Y actually determines the remaining essential properties in coherence with the essential properties already determined by X at time 2. So I think that gives us a model of what it is like for two agents to interact in the authoring of an artifact, of an abstract artifact type and its tokens. So I'd like to argue if two agents, and this is the definition of collective authorship, as you might remember, if two agents, X and Y, interact in determining the essential properties of an artifact Z over time, there is successively collective authorship. And I would like to argue that if X determines some of Z's essential properties and intends Y to determine the rest of Z's essential properties at time 1, and third, Y determines the rest of Z's essential properties at time 2, X and Y interact in determining Z's essential properties over time. And thus, if the second condition, if condition 2 is met, there is successively collective authorship. So the question remains, what is not successively collective authorship? The first case is the concretization or the concretizing of an artifact type. What is meant by concretizing an artifact type? Well, the term concretizing originates from Maria Reicher's work, and concretizing means something along the lines as I define it here. An agent X concretizes an artifact Y if X creates an artifact an abstract entity encoding all essential properties of Y and some accidental properties. And to illustrate that, let me give you an example. Say Y is an electric kettle type, then it's deciding on its color, a concretizing of Y. So Maria Reiche insinuates that concretize an abstract artifact type might be an act of authoring, and that this concretized abstract artifact type is an abstract or a work in its own right. However, I would like to argue that if X concretizes Y, X does not, as the definition shows, does not determine any essential properties of Y. But the definition of authoring or authorship, as I already pointed out, is that an agent X authors an artifact type if and only if X determines the essential properties of Y. Therefore, I come to the conclusion that if X concretizes Y, she's not authoring Y. So if there is an author who has authored an abstract artifact type Y, and another agent concretizes this abstract artifact, then she's not an author of Y. Let's move on to the second case, which is realizing or tokening an artifact type. What is meant by realizing? Well, an agent X realizes an abstract artifact Y if and only if X creates a concrete entity exemplifying all essential properties of Y. Let's have an example. Say again, Y is an electric kettle type, then making a concrete electric kettle of this type, make it a token of this type, is realizing it. Some philosophers of artifacts assume that there is the possibility to become an author in realizing abstract artifact types, for example, Risto-Hippinen. However, the argument is quite similar, because realizing, again, or similar to concretizing, doesn't mean to determine any essential properties of the abstract artifact type. But as the definition of authorship requires the agent to determine essential properties, X is not realizing, X is not authoring Y if she realizes Y. So realizing an abstract artifact type is also not a case of authoring. Let's come to the third and last case, which one might think of as successively collective authoring, and that's continuing fragmentary artifact type. Think of the example I've gave in the beginning of my talk of the novel, which was written, or the first part of it was written by an author who then died in the process of writing, and then finished by another author, or continued by another author. That the question rises: well, is it successively collective authorship? I will argue that it is not, at least not if the first author didn't intend another agent to finish its work. So the first premise of this argument goes that two agents, X and Y, collectively author an artifact type Z if X and Y interact in determining Y's essential properties. That's the definition of collective authorship. However, if Y determines essential properties of Z without X intending her to do so, X and Y do not interact in determining the essential properties of Z. So if the second author, tries to finish the novel after the death of the first writer, and the first writer didn't intend another agent to continue its work, then this is the case. And thus, if Y determines essential properties of Z without X intending her to do so, she is not authoring Y. And I think it's, that's it. However, there might be an objection. One might ask if the conditions in the definition of successively collective authorship isn't too strong, if the case of the novel, the collective authored novel, isn't met. Please notice that the agent X, the first agent, has not to indicate one specific other agent. It's clearly enough for X to intend that some other agent Y determines the essential properties, the rest of the essential properties of the artifact given. Well, thanks for your patience and interest in my talk. Thank you.